everyone. Thanks for joining us today for TCU Presents Elections, Journalism, and the Media Landscape. With hotly contested midterm elections attracting attention all over the country, this is a perfect moment to discuss how news coverage of politics and elections is adapting. As it has through years of American history, journalism continues to evolve. Journalists' work is changing as media outlets adapt to keep up with technology and media formats that give audiences more choices than ever for finding information. The public looks to social media for news, and they often find information that aligns with their existing perspectives rather than information that offers new insights. But despite changes in the formats media audiences use, I believe journalism ethics must remain constant. The key ethical duty of journalists is to report fair and evidence-based, factually and contextually accurate information. Yet audiences distrust journalists and accuse them of bias, perhaps more than ever. I'm Kristie Bunton, and I'm honored to be Dean of TCU's Bob Schieffer College of Communication. I've spent my entire academic career teaching and writing about media ethics issues. So today, I'm delighted to talk about whether there is a changing ethical landscape for journalism with three Schieffer College of Communication alumni. Elizabeth Campbell and Joel Anderson will discuss how they approach election news coverage and general reporting in today's environment. Schieffer College professor Patty Zamarripa will provide perspectives on how our program is training journalists to report ethically and accurately. I want to thank the TCU Alumni Association, TCU Magazine, and the Office of Social Media for gathering us for this session of TCU Presents. Now let me introduce you to our panelists. Joel Anderson is a staff writer and podcast host at Slate.com. He hosted sessions 3 and 6 of the award-winning Slow Burn narrative podcast series, and he co-hosts the weekly sports podcast Hang Up and Listen. He was most recently a national college football writer at ESPN, where he wrote news and narrative stories about the role of race, justice, and sports in American life. He's also worked at BuzzFeed News, the Tampa Bay Times, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Shreveport Times, and the Associated Press. His piece, The Two Michael Sams, is featured in the Best American Sports Writing 2015. Joel's a Missouri City native and a 2000 TCU graduate who lives in Palo Alto, California, with his wife and son. Welcome, Joel.
Thanks for having me. Very long bio. Next time, I'll edit it next time.
Okay. Elizabeth Campbell is a 2018 TCU Journalism and Political Science graduate. As a field producer and digital journalist based in the CBS News Atlanta Bureau, she covers breaking news, trend stories, and politics from North Carolina down to Florida and across to Colorado. During this busy midterm election season, she's frequently traveled across the South to cover events with the president, the former president, senators, representatives, and local officials, while also talking to voters about the issues that matter most to them. Before Atlanta, she was a producer at the #1 Sunday morning public affairs program, Face the Nation, where she produced several reports with our own Bob Schieffer. Welcome, Elizabeth, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I echo Joel's comments. If we had more time, I would have written a shorter bio.
Patty Zamarripa is an Emmy award-winning TV news producer and journalism professor from the border town of Mission, Texas, who graduated from TCU in 2010. Her passion for TV led her to work for news organizations such as CBS News in Washington, D.C., NBC, and the Telemundo Production Center here in Fort Worth. Also Mission Local, a hyper-local news site in San Francisco. She's covered local and presidential elections, the immigration crisis, the state of education in California and Texas, and other major breaking news events. This fall, she's teaching an experimental social media and mobile storytelling course for our journalism majors. Welcome, Patty. Thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
Well, now, let's get the conversation started. I want to start off by asking each of you, what do you see as mainstream journalism's role in covering elections, and has that changed since you started your career in journalism?
I guess I'll start. I find this to be a fairly it's simple in name, not in execution, but informing the public about the people who want to hold power in government and their vision for their role in government in their lives, right? So if you're covering an election, you want the readers who care about the people running in that election. Well, which one of these people believe in improving the power grid in our state, right? If I live on the coast, does the person running for office here, do they believe in addressing climate change? Does a person that I'm voting for in this local school board election, do they believe that I should be able to read Richard Wright? Do they believe that my daughter should have an access to an abortion, right? So basically covering elections are no less than covering the stakes for your life and your loved ones in a society, and what those people, what their vision for government is. And so has that changed since I started in journalism? I don't think it's fully changed. I think that, a lot of election coverage is more about the horse race piece of it. Who's ahead, whatever, scandal of the day matters in election. And that stuff is important too. Like, I'm not, stupid. Like, I understand that it not only is it interesting, but it also is important to cover. But I don't think I think increasingly media outlets are seeing the importance of, hey, not only do we need to cover what the election is, but what do they want to do when they get into office? That is the piece of the coverage that is starting to become more and more a part of the media ecosystem, I think.
And I'll pick up on that. And I think there's also definitely a fact check and an accountability role. The media in a unique perspective of, it is my full-time job to follow these candidates around and ask them questions. So I think we're in the unique position of, we can say, okay, you said you're for the power grid, but 4 years ago you were different, something about that. So I think we have that accountability role, and that's a main thing we're supposed to do. As for how it's changed, that accountability role has become even bigger, especially on if they're going to agree to the outcome of the election. I mean, that's something I never thought I was going to have to ask a candidate, but now I have to ask every single candidate, will you respect the outcome of this election? Right. And I think having even that level of just accuracy and fact check is something we're seeing increase more and more as we go out and talk to candidates.
I would echo both of those responses. I think what has changed is maybe the technology and how we, the technology and the hardware that we use to cover, elections. Hallie Jackson with NBC does, back in the 2016 election, did an excellent job using social media to cover, not just waiting for the nightly news broadcast and what she had filed for that day, but getting the story out there sooner on different platforms, reaching new audiences that maybe aren't tuning in at 5:30 every night. So I think that part has changed. I also think that because of that, covering what Joel was talking about, those extra tidbits that aren't, the scandal of the day or whatever that big piece is, I think because of that, there's just that makes it necessary to cover those things, because you've got social media. Sometimes people are just looking to fill something to tweet out, looking for clickbait. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a good thing, but how we approach the coverage has had to change because of the new technology, because of this. But I think for people from the Schieffer College, I think like Joel and Elizabeth and I think we all understand, like, at the end of the day, the basics of journalism, the fundamentals, the ethics, there's just new questions we have to ask, but how we ask them and what we do and fact checking and verifying, like Elizabeth was talking about, that has not changed. It's just now our reporting process is out there for everyone to see.
Right. We're a lot more accountable for that stuff. Right, Patty? Like, I think that, it used to be, if you wrote something, it's very hard to get the archives of a newspaper. You know what I mean? And like, when I graduated, like, that would have been, well, I want to know what Joel wrote about this. And he wrote about this in, 1998 as opposed to 2004. Right. And so the ways that we're going about our journalism, we're so much more accountable to the public now, that you can't help but be better and be more responsive to the things that the public want to know about these elections and the people running in them. So yeah, no, I definitely agree that like technology has changed a lot of the accountability here for media, and to be frank, a lot of media hasn't adjusted really well. They don't like they don't like the public being their ombudsman in that way.
Especially with, Twitter, you'll get a fact check if something is spelled wrong, if you got something wrong. Twitter will tell you so quickly if you've gotten something different. So yeah, it definitely is, that process is more seen. And since you shouted out Hallie Jackson from NBC, I have to say Ed O'Keefe from CBS as well does a good job of tweeting. There's a little rivalry there.
So what I'm hearing you say is that among the rules that exist for journalists today that were true when you were training here at Schieffer as a journalist, verify factual information, remain accountable. Are there other rules that exist that you learned here that persist as you do your work today?
I think absolutely. I'll take that one first since Joel went first last time. I think it's definitely, we're very focused on getting both sides. I know when I was there, we started Politifrog, which was all political focused. And the main job we were there was to try to offer students context. And I think context has become even more important these days. And so I can't stress that enough for students still there, learning to get both sides, because like we talked earlier, everyone can get whatever news they're looking for on Twitter. And so being able to provide what both candidates are saying and fact checking both candidates and providing that kind of full picture is something that we have to work harder to do. So it's not just that one tweet that gets retweeted a million times that has no context.
Yeah, and I think that there's that. I think one thing is that we're sort of living in a different time, and you mentioned the both sides piece of it, Elizabeth, and that's something that I learned, and that I assume students are still learning today, and I think that's good, but I also think that it can be. I think it needs to be updated a little bit for today's media environment, because sometimes there are some issues that I think that like we in media we can go overboard a little bit with on both sides, right? That like we don't both sides like rape. You know what I mean? Like rape is like a bad thing. We don't talk around it. We don't say, hey, look, there's some people on this side of it that believe rape is a good thing. Like we understand that those people are not to be taken seriously. And I think increasingly we're having to learn in media in real time that sometimes the other side of a story is not necessarily a valid one, or one that necessarily deserves the same airing as one that is based in truth, in fact. And, that's sort of a problem that we're all working through day to day, right? Like you said, you spent some time at a particular political candidate's home recently, and he's saying things, right? Can I say it?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, right. Yeah, she's hanging out with Herschel Walker's family the other day, right? And look, some things he says are true, some things are not. But we don't have to air it out and say that, hey, that badge he showed. We don't have to engage in whether or not there's two sides of the story here. Like clearly that didn't imbue him with law enforcement powers, right? So I think that's like one thing that in media we're having to get better at. That maybe was a little bit more. In 1999, we were just like, we got to report both sides. We're not going to weigh in and make a judgment on it. But I think now, today, maybe people are being pushed to be a little bit more like, hey, look, is that truthful or not? We don't have to give it the same airing as the truth.
So if I can jump in there. So I teach media ethics, and I talk with students a lot here about other sides as opposed to both sides, because I think sometimes recasting the language helps them think. And yet, when Elizabeth's out there on the campaign trail, she's really responsible to CBS for covering Raphael Warnock, the senator in Georgia running on the Democratic ticket, and Herschel Walker running on the Republican ticket. And it does, by definition, become about both sides. So maybe, Elizabeth, you could talk a little bit about how do you try to push or widen out those sides or ignore some things which might not be worth coverage?
Yeah, I'll point to Joel's part earlier about how political races can kind of get beyond the horse race. We've seen in the Georgia Senate race, especially, things have gotten very personal, with accusations from both candidates about the personal lives and personal actions of the other candidate. So now that becomes a thing of when I'm out here talking to voters, I'm asking, sure, about the economy, about abortion rights, about medical care, but I'm also having to ask, what did they make of that moment where Herschel Walker held up the badge? Or what did they make of the moments about Warnock supposedly with these evictions? So it kind of becomes, you have to ask about it, and I have to ask both candidates about it. And it's becoming even more important, that fact check role, because we're having to say accusations against candidate X. This is what candidate X has said. This is what we have found about that accusation. So it really is making sure that you get the full story. Because even again, with the badge situation, I had to go to the sheriff from the county where he got that badge and ask him about how he got that badge. So I hear Joel's point of it does become a point of giving too much weight to everything, but it really does become, you need to track everything down. And so sometimes you'll be listening to what seems like the craziest theory from both sides. And it's your job to take in that information, okay, and say, here, these are the accurate points. These are the points people need to know, and kind of be, for lack of a better word, that filter of what actually makes sense.
So, Patty, how are you teaching about both sides, or sometimes called false balance, in reporting?
Yeah. So I think there's two ways that we kind of attack this. By the time students get to, one of my, like the news production class or advanced news production, where we're actually turning packages and stories and putting them on TCU 360 and on TCU News Now, which is our student produced broadcast. We handle it on a case by case basis. I've had students come to me and say, but I didn't get the other side. And it'll be something about, I don't know, they'll want to go do a story about a new restaurant opening, but I didn't get the other side. Well, what do you mean? Like, you need somebody to say they hate that restaurant? Do we really do that? What is the other side? And so really think about it. With my students, by the time they get to me, they've gone through reporting. And we talk about that on a case by case basis, right? But before that, in my media writing class, which is one of the intro classes, in intro to journalism, and then in reporting, which is kind of that intermediate class with Jean Marie Brown, who's the director of our student media, who taught Elizabeth, and right? Yes.
Jean fan.
Yes, she knows Joel as well. She really focuses on the Maynard Institute, what they teach at the Maynard Institute, which are the fault lines, thinking about how do we look at things from different lenses, different prisms, different points of view, because it's about not necessarily the other side, the opposing side, it's the other voices. What voices are we getting? What voices are we not getting? Where is this how are we looking at this from a generational perspective? How are we looking at this from a geographic perspective? And so when it comes to covering those stories, you have to put that through, you have to go through your fault lines so that you can check yourself and go, do I need the other side? What is the other side? What are the other voices we're hearing and not hearing? And so, she really goes into that in her reporting class. I give them a little taste in intro to journalism, because I think it's important, especially in that class. We talk about media literacy, and though it's not a media literacy class, it's a theme. For me, I think it's important, if there's anything that they walk away from, I get students from all across the university, not just journalists. And I don't know if they're going to be journalism majors or not. They may say, I'm just here to fill a core requirement, and this happened to fit it. So I want them to walk away with, how are journalists covering important issues like this that do need both sides or don't need both sides, or and I make sure to tell them, there's this thing called fault lines, and we actually teach it in the journalism school, and Jean Marie Brown is excellent at it, and has kind of made it important and incorporated it into our reporting students. So that was a long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
No, I have an interjection just for a second, and maybe you guys tell me if I'm off base here, but I just wonder if it's less important to tell stories about sides than telling a complete story as much as possible under the circumstances, right? I mean, because that sort of accommodates Dean Bunton, multiple sides piece of it, right? That, maybe there's one side to this story. Maybe there's four that are equally valid and up for review. And, we're supposed to help guide readers through that. But yeah, I just think the both sides construction is sort of antiquated. And I think we're learning more now. Like, it may be that you have to cover two sides, but we're not airing them equally in the same way. So that's why, like, instead of talking about sides, we're talking about the story as a whole, and have I told a whole, full, complete, truthful story?
Sure. So I think what you're saying is, so pick on Elizabeth again because she's out there on the trail. She's covering an election that has two distinct campaigns.
Yep.
But in any story, you're urging her to tell the most complete story with multiple voices, and I'm sure that's what she's doing. But that makes me want to ask you each, whose voices are not being heard enough in the election coverage, broadly speaking, that you think I, as a viewer or listener, may have access to?
Wow. I guess who are we not hearing? Like with anything, whose voices are we not hearing? Sadly, I don't want to say voters, because I think we get a lot of like contextless, surveys of people that are not necessarily paying attention to the news. And I think that men and women on the street interviews can only tell you so much. But I definitely think that people whose lives are affected is always, like, this is not a new problem. It's a recurring and old problem. The people whose lives are affected by the policies or the proposed policies of the people that are running. So if we're talking about Planned Parenthood escorts, are we talking to people that work the Navy Corps of Engineers who are working on the front lines on the Gulf Coast and say, hey, look, we've got to deal with something that says we're losing, there's a lot of erosion there. I think those are the sort of people who are missing, the people that are right in the middle of it and whose lives will be affected by the policies of these two people. But again, that's easier said than done, because none of us have more resources than we had 20 years ago. Like, I think that's a fairly safe statement to say. And we have limited time. And also we have, we have to write and broadcast things that people are going to pay attention to, right? So, but for the most part, I think that we really need to do a better job of talking to the people whose lives are going to be affected by these things, as opposed to, like, think tanks, political consultants, political spokespeople, that sort of thing. Like, I think they have less of a role in this than the people who are actually on the ground and are experiencing life and living under, if you lived in Georgia, who do you want dealing with power grid issues? Do you want Herschel Walker, or do you want Raphael Warnock? Well, I might want to talk to somebody whose life, like, actually, like, if I work at a hospital, if we have a power crisis, I want somebody that is, qualified to handle that. And so that's the sort of things that I think I'm talking about there.
I would say what's unique to this election, one voice that we've not heard more from, is honestly the poll workers and secretaries of state. We saw at the end of the last election, lots of poll workers getting threatened, getting harassed, secretaries of states. So I think kind of talking to all of those people who are out there so you can vote. Like, you cannot vote unless poll workers work that early polling station, work on election day. And they're often, sometimes they're volunteers, sometimes they're getting paid a little bit. So to me, I'm most interested in that group that's willing to take the time, take the class, help you vote, and help you have your democratic rights. And I think people don't appreciate them as much because they're usually your neighbor down the street or the person at the grocery store. So that's definitely one voice that I'm very interested in.
I would agree. Yeah. Sorry, Dean Bunton. Yes, I would agree with Elizabeth. I remember, 2 years ago when this became an issue, and in 2021 when this became an issue in January, and thinking, man, these people are just trying to volunteer. They're just trying to do their job, and now they're being threatened. So I do remember thinking it'll be interesting to see how this impacts the midterm elections. So I'm glad that you brought that up. That is a voice that we haven't heard more of.
So since we're on this subject of sort of unfamiliar voices or forgotten voices, neglected voices, I want to read you a line from a new book that came out. I think its publication date was yesterday. You may know that Margaret Sullivan, the former media columnist for Washington Post and public editor at the New York Times, has written a book reflecting on her years in journalism. And related to this idea of democracy under siege, she writes in the new book, American journalists should be putting the country on high alert with sirens blaring and red lights flashing. The legitimate press should be figuring out how best to rise to this historic challenge. And then she says, but too many journalists worried about their reputations for neutrality, under pressure from corporate bosses, and mired in their comfortable traditions are still doing their jobs the same old way. It's not good enough. Wow, democracy under attack.
Yeah.
Who or where are you seeing the kind of coverage, in addition to Elizabeth at CBS and Joel at Slate.com? Who else is doing that work that we can turn to in the audience? Who's blaring out the alert that democracy is under attack?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'll just start. I mean, I live in California, so I'm not technically a Texan anymore. Well, I'm always a Texan. Let me not say that. Let me rewind that back. I'm still a Texan. I just haven't lived there in a while. But one media outlet that's done a great job of covering the stakes and all this is the Texas Tribune.
Yes.
I think they're fantastic, and like they have one of their headlines that I was just looking at literally was Ken Paxton, Texas's election denier in chief, closes in on third term. Like, that's speaking to everything that Elizabeth and Patty were just talking about. Like, will you be able to vote? How will you be able to vote? The access to democracy or whatever. And like, the Tribune has been great at that consistently for years. So I definitely, whenever I want to know what's going on in Texas and like the stakes of any particular election, like that's one place that I always start.
I know it's Joel's alma mater, but the Atlanta Journal-Constitution is also a really great resource. And I think even extending it wider, those local papers, we're losing them drastically, but they are crucial because they have the time to really dig into the issues in your area. I mean, the dean mentioned earlier, I'm bopping around constantly. Like I'll drop into a place for a couple of days, talk to voters, and then I have to leave. These newspapers can really take the time to dig into what is the most important issue in your community or your state. And so I think we're really seeing a lot of great work out of those local papers.
At a time when their resources are stretched very, very thin. So shout out to those local.
Yes, subscribe to your local paper.
Right.
I'm still subscribed to papers across the country.
Right, absolutely. That and nonprofit media, there's so many like interesting journalism outlets now that are nonprofit that are starting even in local areas. Increasingly, like I know there's one starting up in Houston in the next year or so. So like they're also doing like that fantastic work. But yeah, Elizabeth is right. Like I'm a newspaper alum of a lot of newspapers that you remember from my very long bio. And so I have a very real investment in it and want to see them thrive. And yeah, they're hugely, hugely important. Yes.
So let's talk about how social media has affected and digital media and these instant platforms, your own reporting, because we're in a really interesting era right now where you have to decide every time you learn something, whether you're going to report it, right? Do you tweet it? Does it get posted and you may be out there in the field without someone fact checking your work? On the other hand, at the other extreme now, because books are so topical, we have a whole spate of national journalists who appear to have saved a lot of great tidbits about the Trump administration and or voter fraud to publish blockbuster books this year. And instead of reporting that stuff in their papers like the Washington Post and the New York Times, how are you striking the balance between how quickly you post and report?
I think Twitter is obviously very, very big for us, especially in the broadcast area. So if I'll shoot something on my phone, I'll try to tweet it out pretty quickly, but I try to always do it. I don't want to call it a tease, but almost a snippet of information. And then obviously with the important context and spell check and all that you can in the field, but then always say at the end, if I have the character limits left, of more to come on the CBS Evening News or more to come on CBS This Morning's. And so it is kind of always reminding people that, yes, this snapshot that I just gave you over Twitter was that most important bite of this just happened. But if you want more information on it, tune in later. Because as Patty's point, there's a lot of people who are tuning in at 5:30 every day they're scrolling while they're on the bus or doing their commute. So it's trying to find that way so you don't get beat. And so an NBC or ABC reporter doesn't tweet something out before you, but that you still bring them back later on. As for the tidbits about books, I think a lot of that, to give them the benefit of the doubt, a lot of times sources will tell us something after it's happened. So that sometimes we put it in a book later. But to us, I mean, especially at CBS, the broadcast is what you're waiting for.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, I'm not in the daily grind of political journalism anymore. Yeah, right. I mean, hey, man, I feel like I served my time, but not, but seriously. So yeah, I'm kind of out of that. But yeah, I mean, I think Twitter and social media are important tools for steering people to your finished product, right? So if to the extent that I'm tweeting about anything that I'm writing about, I'm trying to give them tidbits that will encourage them to read the fuller story that I'm working on. But like it's been a while since anything like that. Until Elizabeth's point, I think she's right about that. Like, I've been sort of circumspect about the conversation around Maggie Haberman and her book, because this is what this is addressing. And look, I mean, obviously, like, we're in a really dangerous and desperate time, and any of the information that appeared in that book would have been useful for people to know at the moment that she learned the information. But Elizabeth is right. Like, oftentimes people won't tell you something until something is way over, or they embargo information for you, and you don't, it can be that sometimes you don't want to burn a source in hopes that you get a bigger, more important story later. So I know that it's really frustrating if you're in the public and you're like, man, it would have been great to know that this person was doing that, when they were running for office. But unfortunately, you just can't share that information. Sometimes you may not even have that information to share at that moment. So, but again, I totally understand the public's frustration with it, because I can feel it in the moment. But I don't know what deal Maggie Haberman or whoever else what deals they strike to get that information. So that's kind of the missing piece here.
Sure. Patty, what are you telling students about a topic like this?
Yeah, I think at the same time, I'm coming off of what Elizabeth is saying, you learn that information. You don't always get it until the end. But at the same time, my immediate reaction when I saw that, that issue with Maggie, and did she hold her, and did she hold that information and just wait for the book? Immediately I thought, that's wrong. That's wrong. As a journalist, your job is to report the news as it happens, when it happens, and that could have made a big difference. But then I remember reading when her book first came out, a review of it, and I think it was in the LA Times, if I'm not mistaken. And it talked about, okay, yes, there were some little tidbits, there were details there, but we knew it didn't really give us any new insight that really could have that would have been the difference maker, or that would have had some sort of an impact on, what was happening in government at the time. So it kind of makes you go back and go, all right, did she do her job? Did she not do her job? These are questions that my students are going to have to face at some point, if and when they become big New York Times reporters and are on Face the Nation one day. That would be wonderful. And they're going to have to think about these things. But as far as dealing with, what are we doing? How are we approaching the news with social media and tidbits of information? There's only so much you can put on Twitter, because you're limited, yes, by characters, and sure, you can do a thread, but that's mobile first, that's digital first, right? We're thinking about what can we get out on social media and Twitter, and then you report throughout the day on your different platforms in different ways. And I think we're teaching that in our classes. And what you stick around for is the best stuff. Your best stuff, your really good stuff, comes on the newscast at 5:30. It's going to push you to want to watch that newscast, because the full entire story with your best quotes and your best information is going to come out. It's not coming out 2 years later or 3 years later in a book. It's just coming out a couple hours later. And so I think there's a way to do that. You have to do that with mobile first. I don't think you can just put everything out there on social media and then regurgitate everything in a newscast or in the newspaper. That doesn't work for viewers. I don't think viewers like that. And we have to think about the viewers, unfortunately. The students have to think about their audience, because without the audience, you don't have a paper, you don't have a newscast, you don't have, so we do have to think about them and, what are we going to put out there? And it is important, we have that conversation, and especially in my intro to journalism class, we have that conversation of being first, being right, and how do you get it out there, and what's okay to retweet and what's not okay to tweet and retweet, and they're big conversations that we have in the classroom.
Well, I think they're incredibly important conversations as well. A million years ago, when I trained to be a journalist, back in the dark ages.
Stop it.
When we were using typewriters in my first intro journalism class, we knew we were always going to be edited by someone. Right? There was always going to be a copy editor. We were always going to have a city editor who looked over our work, because in my first newspaper job, I would cover a city council meeting one night, and I'd come to work the next morning because it was an afternoon paper, and my deadline was about 10 o'clock in the morning. So a lot of people got their eyes on my copy. Today's journalism student is living in a world where she may go to the scene of a school shooting and be asked to go live on a platform like this. And she's going to have to make all those decisions on her own. And we just hope that we've trained her to make the best ethical decisions that she can at that moment in time, knowing that she's a journalist, and our default position as journalists is always to disseminate, to publish, to broadcast, to share, not to withhold. Now, I do just want to go back to Maggie Haberman for a minute and say that I feel like in some ways, even though I don't like people holding stuff for books, she's gotten a little bit of a bad rap, because Bob Woodward's been doing this for years, since Watergate, and the Washington Post has been happy for him to do that. And so it's perhaps always been a kind of question: what do you report, what do you save? But I think our default position, as I said, always ought to be report it. If you verified it, it's borne out by evidence. Let's report it. Would you agree?
I'll go first. I saw Joe and I both jumping at the bit there. I agree. I think it's so much harder to build trust back than it is to explain. So to me, it's always, I would rather be beat on something than post something that was wrong. And so I think, especially, when I have covered mass shootings and you hit the ground and you're trying to figure out things about the gunman, you're trying to think about the victim, and you're getting conflicting information, and it may be conflicting information from police officers who normally we think are a good source of information. But in those situations, it's always give it a beat and always tell your viewers, be honest and open with them. This is what I'm hearing. We're working to confirm it. And I think that's really the biggest difference between a journalist and between a witness who's just a citizen who is on the scene, who starts rattling off everything they see and hear. A journalist is the person that takes that information, like you said, disseminates it, but only after we've verified it, or only after we've kind of given it that test of, is it accurate or not?
Yeah, isn't that the advantage of a book? That, you get this kernel of information, and then you can spend a lot of time going long on where it came from, what's the context for this, who else was involved in this decision, so on and so forth. Obviously, like, you want to report as much as you can, is true, that is as accurate and fair as possible in the moment. But that's, we know what life is like, and we know what it's like being out there reporting something. Like, if I'm stuck someplace like in Ferguson in the middle of West Florissant Avenue, right? Like, there's only so much I'm going to be able to confirm in that moment. And it may take me a week, 2 weeks, a month, whatever, to confirm some other bits of information. So we have to be just sort of realistic about what the job is. And if people get mad at us, they have a case on that. But often, sort of the conventions and just, for protecting yourself and protecting your organization, you may need some more time to verify some things that you're going to go forward with, that you might put in a book that you wouldn't put on Twitter, obviously.
Right.
And I
So,
run my
Patty, go ahead.
I run my students through some exercises like that so that they can, from the producer perspective, but also from the reporting perspective, from the web perspective, all these jobs in the newsroom, whatever it is that you want to be, when you're out covering, that breaking news situation, report what you know and report what you don't know. I think adds to that transparency that Elizabeth is talking about. This is what I'm hearing. I'm working to confirm it. Here's what we don't know. We don't know if anybody's been hurt. We're waiting to talk to police. Police said that they're going to come talk to us any minute now with new information. Giving that information, what you know and what you don't know, is so important. And sometimes, for instance, if there is a mass shooting and it happens to be in the North Texas area, and then I'm in class, I'll stop what I'm doing in that class that day. We'll stop the lesson for the day. I'll put up that broadcast and I'll say, let's watch and talk about what's happening and what they're doing. And here's what I can tell you is happening behind the scenes. Here's what's happening on the ground. And it opens it up so that students can ask a lot of those questions of like, well, what do I do if I don't know? But what if I do, so we have those conversations in real time, even though they're not covering it, even though they're not in the newsroom. We're running through those exercises because one day they're going to be, thrown into the fire, and they need to know what to do.
I think that's the absolute best thing you can do is watching that. I used to watch newscasts almost like I watch a football game. Yeah. So instead of like, what's that touchdown? I'd be like, what's that tease? What's that VO? So I definitely think like consuming it as much as you can, and like internships is the biggest thing I can tell to students. And so I'm glad you're having them watch newscasts so that they know when they go for these jobs, this is the part I want to read in newscasts. And I will say it doesn't matter if you're a producer or a reporter or a photog. If you're on the scene, you are all reporters. Mm-hmm. You are all gathering information. You are all working together. If you heard something, you check it with someone else. There is no one who's not reporting when you're on the ground.
Yeah, and I just want to real quick circle back to something, because I just something that's become more apparent in recent years as I've become a journalist, as I've become a more experienced journalist, and that government agencies and police and law enforcement authorities aren't just disinterested, neutral observers. And we're learning that more and more, right? That they can say something happened, and that statement is something that you may report and say, hey, look, the police say that this happened, but that doesn't mean that, that these are, airtight facts that they're necessarily providing the public. So in many ways, all of these people are political actors, and they have a point of view, or, as I covered, crime and police in a number of places. And I can tell you a bunch of people that the initial police reports are often laughably false for any number of reasons, maybe not even because of any malfeasance, but often police officers are reconstructing events that they did not witness themselves. Like, that is the vast majority of crime in this country. So it's just something that, like, if you're a student and you're watching this, just remember the police are not, they're not infallible. They are not, the information and facts that they put out also demands a fact check or like a review when you're reporting on them or when they're involved in a story.
We just finished watching in my news production class right before this panel, WCCO's documentary on how they covered the murder of George Floyd. And this is called 6 Days in May. And they talked to the reporters and the producers and the anchors and the news director and all that stuff about, what that was like and what it was like to cover that. And that's a perfect example of what you're saying, Joel. Look at what they said about George Floyd. He died in a medical emergency. But the video showed something completely different.
Right. And
there were places, stations, newspapers that went with that and didn't question.
Right. Right. It happens over and over again. Like, that's not even the first, I covered the Freddie Gray trial in Baltimore. And I don't know if a lot of people remember, it was a guy that police chased down, threw him in the back of a police truck. And when he got out, he was paralyzed from the neck down and died about 3 weeks later. And obviously, like, the police had a version of events that a lot of reporters went and wrote down, right? But it was more complicated. It was a much more complicated story than what they wrote down in the initial reports. And so it's just something to remember, that when we're reporting on police or police are a part of a story that you might want to apply the same skepticism to them that you do anybody else.
Absolutely. And now I had expected when you said WCCO, Patty, Elizabeth, to give a shout out, because WCCO in Minneapolis is a CBS owned and operated network affiliate television station where a number of my former students from another university work. They do great work. And having the ability to go back and examine these events through a documentary or in writing a book, I think is very important. But to connect that sort of work with the point that Joel is making, I think is also important. The police are not infallible. We are not infallible as journalists. We all operate out of a particular perspective based on our life experiences, our faith traditions, our socioeconomic class. I'm never not going to be a farm kid from Missouri, right? What kinds of ways do you check some of your identities or your own perspectives at the door when you are covering these kinds of stories, like politics, like crime, social justice? What do you do to try to acknowledge or minimize some of your own identities or perspectives?
Yeah, you want to go first, Joel?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Coordination. Yeah, it gets to the audience question we got about balancing our own personal interests. To me, that is the absolute easiest part of my job, is not letting my own bias interfere, because you are just trained and always thought my personal opinion does not matter here. And that is the biggest advice I can give young journalists, is you are a journalist, not an activist. There are great things on activists on both sides. I support them, but you are not that. Your job as a journalist is the facts. And to Joel's earlier point, facts from everybody. There's nobody that you can trust 100%. You have to verify anything anybody tells you. And so to me, it's always reminding myself that I am not the story. And I think that's a problem we're seeing with more and more journalists, is they want to put themselves in the story. I am not the story. I'm here on the ground to see what the story is from the candidate, from the victim, from whatever is happening. And so to me, it's just kind of that compartmentalization that you're going to need to have as a journalist, both for your own sanity and then also for the unbiasedness of your reporting, is knowing that it doesn't particularly matter what I think, because I'm not running for office. I'm not announcing this new initiative. I'm here to see what other people are saying.
I may depart from you in this way, Elizabeth. So, I came up, I've worked at the Associated Press right out of school, which is, pretty much about as balls and strikes in journalism as you can get. And now obviously I work at Slate, which is a totally different approach to news that does incorporate, whatever my ideas might be about a particular news story. Like it may be more of an essay than a news story, right? And so I don't think it's possible for me to check my identity or my biases at the door when I come in to write a story. And I mean, I think that if everybody sort of sat back and thought about how they end up choosing stories, like if you when journalists say, okay, I'm not a part of the story or whatever, that my bias is not influencing stories, then I say, well, let's see the Slack messages or the text messages that you sent your editor or your friends when you were deciding to write about this story, right? Or which stories did you choose to write about and cover, and which stories are you not choosing to cover or write about, right? And so I can't help but think that all of those things are sort of influenced by what we're interested in, what our backgrounds are, what our familiarity is, right? And so that's how I ended up getting, thrusted into covering Ferguson, right? I had opinions and they were like, well, you seem like you're interested in this. Like, do you want to cover that? And I was like, yeah. And I would defy anybody to say that my journalism was compromised in some sort of way because I had a point of view, or maybe because I was more skeptical of police accounts than somebody who's not had an experience with police, right? So I just think it's sort of tough. I don't think that journalism does not require you to be a totally different human being. It just requires you to be honest about your point of view and your bias, and to contextualize that and say to writers or whatever, you know what, I'm Black, I wrote about this incident that involves police killing a young Black man or whatever. But is the story true? Is the story fact-based? Right? Am I being fair? And I think that's more important than me pretending that I don't have a point of view, or that, like, when you see me come into a room, you know I'm a Black man, right? And so, like, we all know what the deal is, you know what I mean? So, like, I don't think that, like, I have to, like, check any of that at the door. I just incorporate it into my journalism, and I try to be honest about what my blind spots might be, you know, what things that I'm most interested in or whatever. But I think the journalism would be better served if more people approached it in that way, which doesn't mean that, like, you got to, you know, write whatever, you know, political theater or things that are most interesting to you. It doesn't mean that you can't do that, but I just think that it would help people in some ways to have a little bit more trust in the journalism there, because we're all coming to work with our stuff, and we have to do a better job of acknowledging it, I think.
We have this conversation in the intro to journalism course pretty early on, and it turns into a debate. You know, I asked the students, how many of you, you know, think journalists are able to, you know, check all of their stuff at the door? And most of them say, yes, I think it's possible, and I think it's your job, and you should do it, and good journalists do it. But at the end of the day, there's always somebody that comes in and says, how can you do that? And, you know, I'm kind of from both sides, where Elizabeth is saying, like, that's the easiest part for me. But I'm also coming from a side of, you know, for Joel, you know, I'm not going to tell you who I'm voting for.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I'm not going to tell you who I'm voting for, but I am going to vote. I'm not going to tell you that I'm not Hispanic or that I'm not a woman. And I'm going to have opinions because I'm coming from a woman's perspective, or I'm coming from a Latina's perspective. I can't check my identity at the door. But I can certainly make you wonder. And that's always the thing at the end of the class is my goal. I tell them all the time, my goal is that you don't know, you know, who I'm going to vote. You don't know my political views at the end of this class. I don't want you to know. I'm going to do my best for you not to figure me out. Just because I'm still a journalist, even though I'm a professor, I am still a journalist. I still produce. And so, you know, I represent, you know, KXAS, who I freelance for in my time off from teaching. And so it is that side of me is still important. I do want to check my stuff at the door. It is easy for me to do, but there's certain things I can't. And so I have to be honest about that. I have to be upfront about that. But again, check me. It doesn't mean the story was wrong, you know. And something that Jean Marie Brown told me years ago when I first started, you know, everything comes back to Jean. Jean, I hope you're watching. You know, something that she told me a long time ago was everybody needs an editor. Everybody needs an editor. So anytime I do something, just because I'm the professor doesn't mean I don't need an editor. You know, that's how I check myself, even though I have these, you know, things that make me who I am today, and I can't necessarily check them. These biases might come through, but that's why I have editors. That's why I make sure my content gets checked before I put it out.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that one thing that Elizabeth and all of us would agree on here is that we often are the least interesting people in any, you know, when we're reporting on these like amazing people or people that are doing weird or amazing things or incredible things. Like, I mean, nobody really wants to know what we're thinking. You know what I mean? Like, then, you know, they may just want us to be honest about whatever our particular bias is. But I totally agree. Like, when I'm writing a story, I don't think readers very often are like that interested. If I'm writing about Raphael Warnock, I think they probably want to hear a lot more about what Raphael Warnock has to say about something as opposed to Joel Anderson. And like, I totally agree with that. Like, I do not want to center myself into journalism. And I think that's what we're all sort of talking about here, that we all agree on, I believe.
Yeah. And I would make the joke off that everyone who calls and says that we're doing this big conspiracy theory or this and that, I go, I wish I had time to have this, like all this web you think I'm doing. No, like we're just trying to get the truth out. We're trying to get the story out. We have a deadline every day. Like I don't have free time to be putting a conspiracy together.
Right.
Well, on that note, because you do have work to do, one quick round, each of you. What advice would you give for someone who wants to be a journalist today, one of our students?
Whoa. Do you want me to do it? Am I supposed to go first this time? Is that
All you, Joel?
okay?
All you. I'll
All
copy
right.
off you.
Okay. What I would say, yeah, no, please don't. I think there's a couple. Well, the most important thing, I'm not going to make a joke of it because this is actually really serious. I think that you should remain flexible and don't make a lot of plans. Don't make a lot of expectations for what you think your career is going to look like. And the way I explain that is that to Chris, to what I'm gonna call you Dean Bunton. I can't call you my first name. Dean Bunton. When I started, I learned to type on a typewriter as well, right? The iPhone didn't exist, BuzzFeed didn't exist, podcasting was something that was just far off or whatever. When I graduated in 2000, like that, none of that stuff existed, right? And so I was stepping into a totally new world. So I think the thing is to be flexible about like what you can do, but also like at the end of the day, the stories are what matter. And like you need to find the platform for it, like master the basics, and then just be versatile and be sort of open to the idea that, you know what, I may have planned to work at this website, but maybe the best way to tell stories is at a podcast company or whatever. So yeah, I think that's the thing, because I don't know what the environment is going to be 20 years from now. But one thing, if you're really good at telling stories and if you're willing to jump in there, work hard and figure out a different medium, then you'll probably be okay. But yeah, trying to predict the future is sort of a fool's errand. So just be good at what you do, and then hopefully that'll carry you along the way.
I'll add on to that. I mean, I mentioned it earlier, internships. That's the one piece of advice I could give, because we want to see that you know what a real newsroom is like and you know what it's like to actually be out there. Student media, if you can't do an internship. I mean, I was executive editor of TCU 360. Highest advice I could offer is to do that. And I think also then just be realistic. No one is in this business for the money. You are going to work weekends. You are going to work holidays. Since moving to Atlanta in March, I have only been in Atlanta for 1 week, the entire straight. I've only seen parts of Atlanta. So don't expect yourself to be that regular 9 to 5. I will also say this is one of the best jobs you can have. We get a front row seat to history, and you get to tell really important, and to Joel's point, meet really, really interesting people you would never have met otherwise. I would never have met Herschel Walker's mom if I wasn't in this business. So I think just be realistic and be flexible of knowing like there's going to be some jobs that aren't always the most glamorous to start off with, but these are really interesting and really important jobs. You can kind of end your day every day, sometimes at midnight, to wake up at 4, knowing that you helped share an important story that day.
To add on to that, you will call people and they will pick it up and talk to you, or you will show up at their house and they will talk to you. That's just not something that happens in a lot of other jobs or whatever. And people that are important and doing important things. And so, yeah, like that part of it is amazing. And if you dig that, then like, I think you'll do pretty well in this business, but yeah.
I get to talk to young journalists every day and tell them, give them advice and tell them what I think they should do. But for anybody who's not in a class with me, here's what I would say. Be curious. Just just to be a journalist, that's what separates you from everybody else. That's one of the things that separates you from everybody else. Be innately curious. Elizabeth said money. It is not about the money. It cannot be about the money. Just be ready to struggle, be on the struggle bus with everybody else. We've all been there. We've all survived. And those of us who have stuck with it, we love it. We love our jobs. We love what we do. Give it a few years, because the first year is really hard. The first year is really hard because you're not only learning a new job, but you're learning just how to do life on your own. So give it a few years. Don't be discouraged. So many great students with potential go into journalism, and then they're 6 months in, they're like, this is not for me. I'm going to go do PR, which is fine. You can go do PR. That's fine. Just give journalism a couple of years, and then you'll really be able to say whether this is for you or not. You won't be on that morning shift for forever. I promise you, unless you're like me and just are addicted to mornings and you have a problem. And when you are off from work, be off from work. Take that time to be off and rest, because those opportunities don't come often. And when you have them, take them. It's okay the newsroom won't explode without you. Somebody else will be there to step in.
Well, on that wonderful note, we are going to close. I get to say thank you to the TCU Alumni Association, to TCU Magazine, the Office of Social Media Management, and we invite all of you who are alumni of TCU to stay in touch with our Alumni Association at alumni.tcu.edu. And most importantly, I thank Joel Anderson, Elizabeth Campbell, Patty Zamarripa, for giving us a wonderful conversation today. Thank you ever so much. And I think this is where we all say, go Frogs.
Go Frogs. Still